She was forced to marry a blind billionaire to pay her father's debt, a man she'd never even met. But their first morning, behind a door he begged her never to open, she found a room full of paintings of her own face, painted years ago. She had never posed for anyone. So who had been watching her? To understand how a poor seamstress ended up standing in a rich man's locked room, staring at her own eyes on 100 canvases, we have to go back to the small river town where her whole life began to come apart. Amara Okafor was 28, and she had never once held money that she did not already owe to someone else. She lived with her father, Kalu, in 2 rented rooms at the end of a red dirt road, where the roof leaked in the rains, and the landlord's boy knocked on the first of every month. Her mother had died when Amara was 9, and from that day, the 2 of them had held each other up. She sewed dresses for the market women. Kalu fixed generators when his old hands were steady enough. It was a thin, hard life, but it was theirs. Until the afternoon, a black car she did not recognize came crawling up their road like a hearse that had arrived too early. She found her father sitting on the floor when she got home, an opened envelope beside his knee, his face gray as ash. Kalu Okafor was a proud man who had not wept even at his wife's graveside. That afternoon, his eyes were wet, and something behind them had already surrendered. "What is it, Papa?" she asked, dropping her bundle of fabric. He did not speak. He only slid the envelope across the floor toward her, and when she read the figure written inside, her knees stopped holding her weight. 4 million naira, due in 7 days. He had borrowed it 3 years earlier for her mother's hospital bills, money that bought a few extra months and a coffin, from a lender who smiled while he sharpened his knives. What Kalu had never told her was that the lender had lately sold the whole debt to a rich city family whose name was spoken in that town the way people speak of a coming storm, the Nwosus. And they had not stumbled onto the Okafors by accident. Someone in that great house had gone looking for Amara on purpose, for a reason no one in those 2 little rooms could have guessed. 2 days later, a woman in white lace stepped out of the black car and walked into their home as though the cracked walls belonged to her. Gold sat on every one of her fingers. She looked at the single bulb, the mattress on the floor, the sewing scraps, and she smiled. Not warmly, but the way a hunter smiles when the snare has finally closed. "Kalu Okafor," she said, "you owe my family 4 million naira, and we both know you will never find it." Her name was Nneka Nwosu, and her eyes moved slowly around the room until they settled on Amara. They stopped there. They studied her face, her brow, the small old scar above her left eyebrow, the way a jeweler studies a stone he has been hunting for years. Kalu, too frightened to notice it, kept his gaze on the floor. "There is another way to settle this," Nneka went on. "My nephew is looking for a wife." Kalu lifted his head slowly, not understanding. Nneka explained in her calm, unhurried voice. Her nephew was Obinna Nwosu, 35 years old, the only son and sole heir of the entire Nwosu fortune, the houses, the land, the oil money, more wealth than that town would earn in a lifetime. "He comes from a great family," she said. "Give your daughter to him, and your debt vanishes like breath on a mirror. Refuse me, and I will take this house and everything you own before the week is done." She let that sit. Then she added the details she had been saving, watching Amara's face as she said it. "There is only one thing you should know about my nephew. He has been blind for 9 years. He will never see the woman he marries." Amara wanted to shout that she was a person and not a debt to be paid, but she looked at her father, the man who had carried her out of floods on his shoulders, who had gone to bed hungry so she could eat, and she knew that if she refused, the shame would finish him quicker than any lender. So she gave the answer that would change both their lives. "I'll do it," she said. Nneka's smile widened, and it was not the smile of a woman who had won by luck. It was the smile of a woman watching a plan she had spent a year building slide neatly into place. That night, Amara packed her few belongings into one small bag, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, she placed the one thing she owned that no debt could touch. It was a small carved wooden bird, no larger than her thumb, its wings rubbed smooth by 20 years of her fingers. She had no memory of where it came from. Her mother used to say Amara simply walked home one afternoon as a little girl of 8, soaked to the bone, shivering, refusing to let it go, after the year the great flood came to the river town. Amara had asked 100 times whose it was. Her mother never had an answer. She only knew that when she was frightened, she held that little bird and hummed a soft tune she had never been taught, a lullaby with no name that had simply always lived inside her chest. The house they drove her to 3 hours away was not a house. It was a fortress behind tall iron gates that swung open like a mouth. Gardens stretched wider than her whole town square. The floors were marble and threw her footsteps back at her. And the wedding they held was not a celebration, it was a viewing. Dozens of powerful guests in expensive cloth turned to look at her as she passed, and their whispers followed her up the aisle like flies. Where did they even find her? Does she even know what she is married into? At the front of the great hall stood the man himself. Obina Nwosu was tall and unnaturally still, dressed in black, dark glasses covering his eyes, though the day was gray. He did not turn as she approached. When the officiant folded her small trembling hand into his fingers were cold, and then, for one strange moment, they moved slowly across the back of her hand, tracing it, as if he were trying to read something written under her skin. He drew back sharply, the way a man pulls away from a fire. He spoke his vows so quietly she barely caught them, his face turned always to the side. And when it was done, when they were husband and wife, he leaned toward her ear. "Do not open the door at the end of the west wing," he murmured. Then he rose and walked away without her, leaving her alone among 200 strangers who pitied her and would not say why. Her first night as a married woman, she sat on the edge of a bed the size of her old bedroom, still in her white dress, holding the wooden bird to her heart and humming the nameless song to keep from crying. The little carving in her palm and the tune on her lips were the two ends of a secret 20 years deep, a secret a proud woman in white lace had already stitched into a trap around her throat. Morning came gray and silent, and Amara, who had never in her life been able to leave a locked door alone, went walking down the long west corridor where the servants did not go. The door was old and heavy, and it was locked, but the key hung on a nail beside the frame, as though the master of the house trusted a single command to keep it shut. For a long moment she stood with her husband's whisper in her ears. Then she turned the key, and the door swung inward, and the breath left her body. Paintings, from the floor to the ceiling, stacked against the walls, hung in crooked rows, leaning 3 deep in the corners, dozens of them, and every single face was hers. Her eyes, her mouth, the small scar above her left brow, exact to the last curve. Some canvases showed a little girl of 7 or 8 in a faded green dress, laughing, half-turned as if caught mid-run. Others showed a grown woman with Amara's own face, gazing out with a quiet Amara recognized from her own mirror. She stumbled backward into a stack and knocked a canvas to the floor, and when she lifted it, her hands were shaking too hard to hold it steady. In the bottom corner, in careful strokes, was a date. It had been painted 20 years ago. She would have been 8 years old.
She had never met this man. She had never posed for a soul. She had never set foot in this city until yesterday, and yet here was her own child face painted by a stranger in the year of the flood. "I asked you not to open that door." She turned. Obina stood in the doorway, his dark glasses gone, his sightless eyes fixed on nothing. His face was carved from grief. He could not see her, but he tilted his head toward the small sound of her breathing, and what he said next pulled the floor out from under her. "For most of my life, I have been waiting for the girl in these paintings to walk into this room. I only never believed she was real."
Amara did not leave that room for a long time, and Obina did not chase her out. He lowered himself onto a stool among his own paintings, no longer a fearsome billionaire, but a tired, wounded man surrounded by a face he had chased for 2 decades. He was not cruel. That was the first lie of that house to fall apart. The servants moved around him as if he were a curse, but Amara began to suspect they feared the story more than the man. He navigated his enormous home by memory and touch, counting steps, brushing his fingertips along the walls. He ate alone. He spoke rarely. When she asked at last how a blind man came to have a room full of a woman he had never seen, his whole body stiffened, and he only said, "That room is a door into the past. In this house, the past is a dangerous thing to open." He would say no more, but the way he said it told her something important. She was not the only prisoner behind these walls. Over the days that followed, against everything she expected, the fortress softened at the edges. It began with small things, the way trust always does. One evening, a servant set 2 places at the long dining table instead of 1, and Obina, hearing her sit, asked her quietly to describe the food to him, because taste was easier when someone spoke the colors aloud. She told him of the deep red of the stew and the gold of the fried plantain, and the corner of his mouth moved, the first thing close to a smile she had seen on him. "You describe food like a woman who has been hungry," he said. "I have been," she answered. "You describe silence like a man who has had too much of it." He went very still, and then unexpectedly he laughed, a short, rusty sound, as if the hinge of it had gone stiff from disuse. After that, the meals were shared. In the evenings, she read the newspaper aloud to him, and he took to walking the garden on her arm, letting her be his eyes. Neither of them called it anything, but something was growing in the cracks of that cold house, quietly, the way grass grows through stone. Amara did not forget where she was, though. She had learned young that the softest room can hide the sharpest knife, and she kept her eyes open. She noticed how Neneka and not Obina controlled every coin the estate spent, while the true heir was kept far from his own accounts. She noticed how a huge, silent bodyguard named Jelani was always somewhere near whenever Neneka's tongue turned cruel, not helping, not stopping it, only watching with a stillness she could not read, his jaw tight as though he were swallowing words. Once, when Neneka struck a young maid across the face over a dropped cup, it was Jelani who quietly stepped between them and picked up the broken pieces, saying nothing, his eyes on the floor. Amara filed that away. And she noticed the tea. Every evening at 6 o'clock, Neneka herself carried a cup of dark tea to her nephew and stood over him and watched him drink every last drop before she took the cup away. She did it with a smile. She did it without fail. A woman who cared nothing for Obina would not cross a house each evening to watch him swallow, unless what mattered was not the caring, but the watching. Before Amara could learn what was in that cup, the past she had been chasing finally opened its mouth. It happened on a night the power failed, and the 2 of them sat together by a single candle, the great house black and quiet around them. It was Obina who spoke first. He had not been born blind, he told her.
When he was 15, his family kept a country home near a river town, and that year the rains came too hard, and the river rose too fast and tore away the low bridge while he was crossing it. He went under, drowning, tangled in his own clothes, when a girl, a small village child of 7 or 8, waded out along the broken pilings, seized his collar, and screamed for the men on the bank until they hauled them both from the water. She never gave her name. She was gone into the crowd before he could thank her. But he had seen her face for one burning moment, and it had branded itself into his mind. He could still see for years after that, he said, turning the candle slowly in his fingers. And in all those years I painted her, the child I remembered, and the woman I imagined she was growing into somewhere out there. I painted her 100 times, trying to guess a face I would never see again. His voice dropped. Then 9 years ago, the darkness came, and I painted my last one. And after that, I could paint nothing at all. But I kept every canvas, because she gave me my whole life, and I never once said thank you. Amara sat frozen, her hand drifting without thought to the wooden bird in her pocket. A cold, impossible idea was rising in her chest, and she pressed it down because it could not be. It simply could not be. "How did the darkness come?" she asked quietly. Obina's face changed. "That," he said, "is the one thing no one in this house will allow me to speak of." The answer came to her 3 nights later, and it came from the last person she would have chosen. It came from Jelani. He found her alone in the garden after dark, and the silent giant spoke for the first time, his voice rough as an unused road. "You have been watching the tea," he said. It was not a question. Amara's blood turned to ice. "You watch it because you are not a fool. So watch it more closely, madam. Watch it very closely." He pressed something small and cold into her palm, closed her fingers over it, and walked back into the shadows before she could speak. It was a glass bottle, old and dust-filmed, half full of a colorless liquid. Taped to the side, in faded ink, was a date from 13 years ago. Amara stood alone under the stars, holding a poison she did not yet understand, and understood only this: a man who never spoke had just risked his life to put it in her hands. She barely slept. Between the bottle and the wooden bird, piece by piece, the true shape of the house assembled itself in the dark. Obina was not cursed. He was being poisoned, a little every evening, for years, in the cup of dark tea his aunt smiled to see him drink. That was the darkness that stole in his sight, slowly, year after year. And the 3 brides the servants only ever whispered about, the ones who came before Amara and then simply vanished, had not run away. They had come too close to the cup, and they had been silenced. Amara was meant to be the 4th. But she had not been grabbed in a hurry like the others. She had been hunted across the whole country for one specific face, and that was the piece that would not fit. Because a woman only after a fortune would never need the exact girl her nephew had loved for 20 years. The reason clicked into place a week later, in the middle of a party, in front of everyone. Nkeka threw a great celebration to present the new bride to society, an evening of gold and music and every powerful face in the city. Amara moved through it with the bottle's secret burning in her chest and a plan folded into her handbag. In secret, she had carried a single drop to a chemist across the city and paid to have it named. The written result was in her handbag now, and she meant that night to climb the stairs and expose Nkeka before every witness in the room. She reached the landing. She turned to the crowd. She opened her mouth, and Tunde stepped forward first. Tunde was Obina's young lawyer, and in Amara's first frightened days, he had been the one soft voice in the cold house, bringing her tea, telling her gently that if she ever wished to leave, he could arrange it. She had let herself think of him as a friend. Now he lifted his hand for silence, and in a loud, clear voice he said, "Before the new madam speaks, perhaps she can explain this." Between his fingers he held a glass bottle, the twin of the one hidden in Amara's room. "It was found among her things," he told the gasping crowd. "It is the very poison that has been slowly killing our beloved Obina these many years. His new wife married him for his fortune, and she has been finishing what we all believed was illness." The hall erupted, and Amara understood, far too late, that she had not walked up those stairs to spring a trap. She had walked into one that had been built for her weeks before she ever arrived. It became worse in a single breath. Obina was there, at the foot of the marble stairs, and he had heard every word. When she cried out to him, his face closed like a shutter. "I opened the one door I have never opened for anyone, and you were killing me the whole time." "Obina, no! It is her! It is your aunt! You have to listen to me!" But the police Nkeka had so thoughtfully invited to her party were already moving through the crowd, and Tundalim already placing the chemist's report into their hands. Amara's own report, the proof she had paid for, now twisted into the evidence that would hang her. The cold metal closed around her wrists in front of 200 staring faces. As they turned her towards the doors, Nkeka leaned close to her ear, and what she whispered told Amara exactly how completely she had lost.
"You poor, stupid girl," Nneka breathed. "You were never going to be his wife. You were always going to be the one they blamed." The great doors closed behind her, and it seemed there was no way back. They put Amara in a police cell that smelled of rust and old fear, and for the first time since she watched her father weep on that dirt floor, she truly gave up. She had no money and no family who could reach the city. Her husband believed she was his murderer. Jelani had vanished. The one document that could have cleared her was now the rope around her neck. She sat on the concrete, drew the wooden bird from where she had hidden it in the folds of her wrapper, and did the only thing that had ever comforted her. She hummed the old nameless lullaby, soft and low, alone in the dark. She could not know that across the city, that same tune was already loosening the first stone of Nneka's careful wall. Because a blind man remembers with far more than his eyes, and Nneka had forgotten it. While Amara sat in her cell, Obina turned her last words over in his black room. "It is her. It is your aunt. Listen." He did not want to believe it, but a blind man learns to trust the small truths that seeing people walk past, and one had been gnawing at him since the party. When the police carried that bottle near him, he had caught its scent, faint, bitter, like almonds gone wrong and gone cold. He knew that smell. He had breathed it every evening for years, rising from the cup of eye medicine his aunt pressed into his hands and watched him drink. The poison in the bottle and the medicine in his tea were the same thing, and only one person had ever carried him that cup. He rose in the dark, heart slamming, understanding at last that he had not lost his sight to a curse or an illness. It had been taken from him, drop by patient drop, by the one person he trusted to care for him. He was not as alone as Nneka believed. That night, Jelani came to him, the man who had served the family 20 years and stood silent in every dark corner of it until the silence had nearly become his whole self. At last he laid it all down. 13 years ago, Nneka had seen Jelani mixing the medicine with his own eyes and said nothing, because he was a poor man with a wife and children, and she had promised to destroy them all if he spoke. But he had kept one bottle of the poison hidden against a day like this, and he had kept one thing more, which he now placed in Obina's hands. A small scratched voice recorder he had hidden in the study the night Nneka and Tunde first spoke their plan aloud. On it, clear as glass, was Nneka's voice. "Let the girl fall in love with him. Then we frame her for my poison, and everything the boy owns comes to me." Obina closed his fingers around it, but a recording could be called a forgery, and a bribed bodyguard's word could be bought back. He needed Nneka to say it again, aloud, in her own proud voice, before people who could not be paid to forget.
And having spent 9 years knowing exactly how his aunt's pride worked, he knew how to draw it out. You give a proud woman a stage. You let her believe she has already won. For 3 weeks, the police did what the party had not allowed. Jelani led them to the hidden bottle. The estate's tea was tested. Both held the same rare toxin. Obina's doctors, pressed at last, admitted that his creeping blindness and his years of frailty matched no illness they could name, but matched chronic poisoning exactly. The files on 3 vanished brides, closed for years, quietly reopened. Only when the evidence stood on its own feet, without needing the tape at all, did they set a date for court. Nneka never guessed how deep the ground beneath her had been dug. She still believed she was walking in to watch a gutter girl sentenced for her own crime. The courtroom was full of the same rich, powerful faces that had watched Amara fall. Nneka sat in the front row in white lace, calm and gracious, a picture of a wronged and grieving aunt. Tunde stood ready with his rehearsed testimony. Amara was brought in thin and pale, chains at her wrists, certain this was the last free walk of her life. Then the great doors opened, and Obina Nusu came in alone, unguided, uncovered, counting his own steps towards the front, while a silence spread through the room so complete you could hear the ceiling fans turn. The helpless blind heir, the man everyone believed was quietly dying, had come to speak, and no soul in that room, least of all his aunt, knew what he had come to do.
"I do not believe my wife poisoned me," Obina said to the judge, and his voice carried to the last row. Then he turned his blind face toward the front bench, toward the woman in white lace. "Toward you, Aunt Nneka. Every evening, for years, in my tea." The room broke into noise, and Nneka rose to her feet, and her gracious mask cracked straight down the middle. And then she made the one mistake that proud people always make when they are certain they have already won. She did not stay silent. She laughed. "You broken, foolish boy," she spat, loud enough for every soul in that courtroom to hear. "Do you truly believe anyone will take the word of a blind man over mine? I built all of this. I found that gutter child and I bought her father's debt to drag her here. I put the bottle in her room with my own hands. I have run this family for 14 years and I will run it for 40 more, and there is nothing a sightless cripple can do to stop me." She stood there breathing hard, 14 years of buried fury pouring out of her at last, in front of a judge, in front of 200 witnesses. And in the silence that followed, Obina reached into his coat, set the small scratched recorder on the table before him, and pressed a button. Nneka's own recorded voice filled the room. "Let the girl fall in love with him, then we frame her for my poison." The taped words and the shouted words matching each other, line for line before every witness present. The blood drained from her face. She had not been undone by the evidence the police had gathered. She had been undone by her own mouth. And Tunde, watching the ship go under, did what small men always do. He spun toward the judge and began to babble that it had all been Nneka's design, that he had only ever followed her orders, sealing them both. But the whole truth of it was not finished. When the officers moved to take Nneka, she did not fight. She sank back into her chair, and the fury drained from her, and what remained underneath was not a monster at all. It was a mother. "You want to know why?" she said, quietly, and the room leaned in to hear her. 20 years ago, there was a flood in a river town. My son was on that bridge when the water came, my Emeka. He was 9 years old. Amara went utterly still.
The land upriver belonged to this family. My brother, this boy's father, built a dam to keep the water off his precious estate, and when the great rains came, that dam sent the flood down onto the poor towns below, onto my boy. They saved their heir and let my boy drown, and then they paid me to keep my mouth shut and call it an accident. The tears ran freely down her face now. So yes, I took his eyes, I took his fortune, I took all of it, one slow drop at a time, because they took my entire world in a single afternoon and dressed it up as bad weather. No one in that courtroom could forgive what she had done, but not one of them, watching her weep, could pretend they did not understand it. She had not been cruel for the pleasure of cruelty. She was a mother who had been broken so completely that she had spent 20 years turning her grief into poison for the boy who lived and for herself. And then came the last piece, the one that had been hanging at Amara's throat the whole time. Obina turned toward the sound of his wife's quiet crying, crossed the floor, and knelt in front of her chair. "The girl from the flood," he said, "the one who pulled me out of the river. I searched for her my whole life and never found her. But when I took your hand at our wedding, I felt something I could not explain, and I have not stopped feeling it since." He reached up, and before the whole silent room, his fingers found the small wooden bird hanging now on a cord at Amara's neck. They moved over it slowly, the worn wings, the tiny notch cut in the tail. His blind eyes filled. "I carved this," he whispered. "I whittled this the summer of the flood when I was 15, and I pressed it into the hand of the little girl who dragged me out of that river because it was the only thing I owned, and I wanted her to keep something of me." His voice broke apart. "It was you. It was always you. You saved my life when we were children. I painted your face for 20 years without ever knowing your name. And then they hunted you down and dragged you into my house to destroy you, and I very nearly let them."
Amara, chained and weeping, felt the bird and the song and the 100 paintings finally fall into place all at once. She had been 8 years old, waist deep in a flood, holding the collar of a drowning boy who hummed a tune to keep them both from panic while the men fought toward them. She had walked home soaked, clutching a carved wooden bird, humming a stranger's lullaby, and she had carried both against her heart for 20 years, never once knowing what they were. They freed Amara that same afternoon. Neka Nuosu was taken away to answer for the poisoning of her nephew and the deaths of 3 young women who had come too near her secret, and Tunde was taken with her. The great cold house on the hill, after 20 years, was finally emptied of its ghosts. But real justice is quieter than people imagine. It does not roar. It settles slowly, like dust after a storm. In the weeks that followed, Amara did not become a grand madame and never wished to. She brought her father, Kalu, to live in the big house, and she watched the proud old man weep the day he finally understood that her daughter was safe and free and, against all odds, loved. He had written to her twice while she was married and once while she was in the cell, short, worried letters in his careful hand, telling her to keep her eyes open and her heart guarded, and she kept every one of them in a drawer beside the wooden bird. Obina's sight did not come back. The long years of poison had taken it for good, and that was the one wound no verdict could mend. But there is more than one way to see a person. Each evening now, Amara led him by the hand into the west wing, into the room of her own painted faces, and described them to him one by one. "This is the one where I am a child by the river. This is the one where I am laughing at something you imagined. This is the one where you gave me a woman's face you had never even seen." He would listen, and he would smile,
and the room that had held so many secrets slowly became the most peaceful place in the house. On a quiet evening near the end of that first year, as the sun went down gold over the gardens, Amara sat with the little wooden bird resting in her open palm and hummed the old nameless lullaby, the one that had lived in her since she was a girl in a flood. Beside her, Tunde turned toward the sound, and softly he began to hum it with her. He had hummed it that day in the river, he told her, to keep a terrified little girl from going under while he sank. She had carried his song and his bird for 20 years without ever knowing whose they were. And now, at last, they hummed it together. A blind man who had painted a face he could not see, and a poor girl who had saved a life she could not remember, sitting in the same room on the same evening with nothing left standing between them but the truth. And that, in the end, was the only thing either of them had ever truly needed.